Hi, it's March 30th, and Bemidji State University is returning to school today, virtually. Since we're going to be watching video lectures and doing discussions on Zoom, I wanted to post a video of a discussion that the history reading group did last week. A slightly smaller group met this time, but I want to thank Kate Brecky, Melissa Spartz, and Stephanie Carlson for participating, and Emily Belland for organizing the meeting. Thanks also to my colleague, Dr. John Ellis, for also participating. Here's an hour of discussion about the similarities and differences between the late 1960s and the present, based on a couple of readings. One from a late 2017 U.S. News article by Kenneth T. Walsh, and also excerpts from Ezra Klein's 2020 book, Why Are We Polarized? I thought it was a good discussion, and I hope you find it interesting. Thanks.
Okay, well, we should probably get started.
Yeah, so Emily, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, no, sure. Okay, well, just welcome everybody. I can see we got some new faces, which is really exciting. So basically, why we kind of picked these topics was because we were looking at the polarization of the United States political systems. And we kind of chose looking at 1968 because there was a lot to be said, which is what that first article talked about. And then we also were doing the Ezra Klein book, Why We're Polarized. So, I don't know, I have just a couple of different questions. I don't know. But I guess what would be, one thing that I really thought about, which was cool, was both articles discuss college students. And I made a point of saying, pointing that out because that's what a lot of us are, is really connected to the colleges. So I guess, what did you guys think of that? This is a starting off.
Yeah, why don't we start off with the article?
Yeah.
That's where that was mostly mentioned.
Yes.
You want to get started, Kate?
Sure. Well, first of all, I really, really enjoyed this topic because it's so true. You can't talk politics with somebody until you understand where they stand politically, because all it takes is one comment one way and it starts an argument. And we noticed that in our Russia class. We kind of went off topic one day and it was a little riff between a couple of the students, and you got to kind of find the middle ground. But as I was reading this, it's things that, because I started taking notes, and I would write Black Lives Matter movement. I wrote that down immediately. That's the first thing that I saw when I was reading this. And then eventually it came up in the article. So a lot of things that I was thinking of also came up in the article too. So it was pretty interesting. But it definitely does relate to us as college students, but I feel less so now than in 1968. I would say.
So you're saying that the polarization of today is less college student centric than it was in 68? Is that what you're arguing?
I don't know if I would necessarily go that far, but I think that college students in 1968 were a lot more interested in politics. My friends, if I ever bring up politics, they're like, "Oh my God, stop. Don't even bring it up." Because I'm passionate about it, and I like to discuss about it. And a lot of kids, they're like, "Yeah, that's all fine and dandy, but I don't care."
Right. Yeah. It does seem like we at least we like to remember the 60s, and especially 1960. 1968 was the summer of love, right? So that is kind of a moment when youth was really kind of pushed to the foreground. What did you guys think about this idea that this was the moment of kind of critical mass? They kind of go down this laundry list of the things that happened throughout the year of 1968, and some of them seem to be very big things, like Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated, and and Bobby Kennedy's assassinated. Other parts of it I was less convinced by. Other parts, especially the identity politics stuff. How'd you feel about
Yeah, so I thought that, like, when it came to, like, discussing how, like, feminist issues and, like, civil rights issues, like, with race and stuff like that were starting to become, like, a really big issue in 1968, I feel like as much as we like to think things have really changed since then, I don't think that they really have, because we're still seeing, especially, like, with the presidential election coming up in November, like, we're still seeing all these, like, contentious debates about, like, race relations and feminist topics and everything like that. So while, like, progress has been made since 1968, like, things aren't all that different today.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. I wrote down, because I agreed with a lot of the things in the article and wrote those down, but I also wrote down the differences. I feel like 1968, maybe not necessarily this specific year, but in between the 60s and the 70s, there was a lot of change, but now we're just continuing it. I don't think it was something that fixed the problem. I think it may have highlighted it, and now we're continuing that discussion, like police brutality and race relations and feminism and etc.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so, like, 68 might be the first point where we saw these, like, issues come to light, but things definitely weren't fixed in that time period.
Mm-hmm.
One thing I really wondered is what your take on the article towards the end argued that I guess it was written in 2018. It was speculating whether 2018 would be a second 1968 in terms of an existential crisis for the identity of the nation. And I mean, now that 2018 is come and gone, I guess we can reflect on that. Do you feel that that was an accurate prediction? Do you feel that the author overemphasized to the significance of 2018 or underemphasized it? I guess I was really curious about that in particular.
I guess in my mind, like, I see the more existential crisis of, like, American identity, like, in 2016, right after Trump got elected, just because, at least, like, in my experience, like, I wasn't old enough to vote in the 2016 presidential election. So, like, the people that I went to high school with, we all kind of had this conversation. And, like, after Trump was elected, we were like, we're not going to let this happen again. Like, what can we do to, like, influence the next election? So at least I think for, like, the younger generation, I would say, in my experience, the existential crisis came right after Trump was elected, when we were like, we're going to have the power to, like, get someone we want with, like, issues we support their stance on into office the next time around.
Do you think that, well, then do you think, Stephanie, that 2016 was akin to, based on your historical understanding, akin to 1968 in terms of historical significance for the country?
I do think so, just because I think that, like, Trump's election was shocking for a lot of reasons for a lot of people, and I feel like it was kind of a wake-up call as to, like, your voice in politics and your vote does actually matter. And I think a lot of young people especially are starting to realize that. So I think we're going to kind of see, like, the aftermath of that play out this November, when, like, all the people who didn't get to vote in 2016 are now old enough and are, like, politically charged enough to, like, exercise their vote and try to get what they want.
Mm-hmm. Right, because there was kind of a blue wave in 2018.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think, Kate?
Just to kind of combat that, like, I agree. I was probably I was I was not happy that Trump was elected. I was like, this is craziness. But a lot of people, even people that I'm good friends with, really support Trump. And so I think there was more of a polarization of, like, people, it's like people either strongly support Trump or they strongly dislike him. Like, I don't think that there's a lot of a middle ground here. And so, like, although there are those people, like you said, that are politically charged now, who are younger, who want to prevent somebody like Trump being president again. But then there's also those people that believe that he's doing amazing things for the country and that he's an awesome leader. So I think it really did, in the sense with 1968, there was a big like difference, or a big separation of people that either supported the war or was super against the war, and that was more so age targeted, whereas now I don't think it has anything to do with how old you are. I think that there's college students who really support Trump who really don't support Trump. There's working class people who really support Trump or don't. There's older people who really support Trump or don't. I don't think that there's a separation there by age.
So Kate, if you don't think that age is the primary determinant of the polarization in the country, what is your reading on it? What is the determinant or determinants?
Well, see, I think there's a lot of factors that come into play here. A lot of people really like Trump because he's not a politician. Like, that was like his biggest thing, is he's not a politician. He's not going to be controlled by politics. And I think that appealed to a lot of people. He was a businessman. And I think he was up against Hillary Clinton when a lot of people, even Democrats, were not in support of Hillary Clinton. And so there was a lot of different things that came into play here. But it's hard to say that there's necessarily one determinant as to why, I don't know if I could necessarily pinpoint that. I think that there was a lot of things that came into play with his stuff.
To that extent, it is similar to this moment that they're talking about in this article, when we have this contested convention at the Democratic National Convention in August. And they don't explain why that, in that paragraph towards the end, they talk about rioting erupted in the streets, in Chicago, and police clashed with, violently with thousands of protesters. Well, one of the reasons for that was that, what they talk about a little bit later in the paragraph, it was ironic that amid all the turmoil and desire for change, both major parties nominated establishment figures as their leaders, right? You get the former Vice President, Richard Nixon, who lost to Kennedy, going up against the former Vice President, Hubert Humphrey. Right, and there were during the primaries, there were more radical, less establishment, less machine politics candidates on offer, and so and that's an element that people are sort of comparing to the present as well. The whole idea of a contested election, and one thing that we didn't have at the time, though, was to scroll back to the beginning of the thing. We had Walter Cronkite, right? Trusted by millions to tell it like it is. Yeah. So that's a little bit different today. Right,
because media, both political parties in their own way questioned the legitimacy of the news media, where you still had in 1968 what were considered in the media neutral, unbiased sources, and that's gone by the wayside. One thing, Kate, that you had said at the very start, and I was curious what all of you thought about this. You had mentioned that in classrooms, students, it can turn into a heated debate very quickly, but students are also reticent to talk about politics for that very reason, because they know how, and I think, that's true in the American population at large. It's not just true for students. Is that a difference from 1968? And if so, why might that difference have arisen?
Personally, I would definitely attribute a lot of that to social media. I think that in 1968, there were a lot of people who were ready to talk about these things. They were passionate about it. Whereas now it's, I'm still passionate about what I believe in, but I tread very lightly when I start talking about politics. I don't just come out guns blazing and say, this is what I believe, and if you believe anything else, then you're wrong, because that's how you start heated arguments. But with social media, I think that it definitely did make an impact as to like how people talk about it, because like you see people, I don't know how to articulate this, but I think that definitely did, and political correctness in that as well.
I mean, are you, oh yeah, go Stephanie, sorry.
Through social media, like, people now have the opportunity to like talk about their like political beliefs and stances with people who don't just like live around them. So like you can like live in Minnesota and have a political debate with someone like across the country or across the world. And I think that's like another way that social media has really changed like how young people are so involved in politics, because we can get all these different perspectives.
Mm-hmm. Do you feel at all that there's a loss of privacy? Because it strikes me that you know, some of these people who went out to the civil rights movement, right, and marched, right, or who took these strong political stances, were also able to then turn around, go home, and live their lives privately, right? They, you know, this wasn't necessarily something that was going to follow them everywhere and forever, the way that social media is. If you say anything, you know,
Absolutely,
it becomes part of your record for, you know, for eternity.
Yeah, that's one of the things I was wondering. And I was also wondering, to a degree, do you also see the inverse of this? With social media, you have the potential to form communities nationwide of people who are entirely like-minded with yourself. So you could have conversations with people who are just in your line of thought. And so when you're in a more face-to-face public forum, you don't even necessarily feel like you need to have those conversations because you're having it with people who are like-minded.
mm-hmm.
You know,
today people are just less willing to compromise. I think people are it's like if you say one wrong thing to somebody, it really can resonate them in a specific way. And I think, like you said, if you're talking to people who agree with you, then why would you want to talk to somebody who you don't agree with?
yeah.
Mm-hmm. And how would you know that they exist if you live in a filter bubble as well?
Yep.
I think that like that's one reason why like I'm always hesitant to talk about like my political beliefs with people, especially people that I don't know, like in class and things like that, just because like you never know who the people are who are like so set in their political beliefs that they're not willing to hear the other side. And then that's not really like, it ends up not even being a conversation because it's just two people talking at each other if they can't both be open-minded.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
What do you think, Emily?
I don't know. I think that one thing that really strikes me is a lot of these things that happen on college campuses appear to be more like grassroots movements from the ground up kind of thing. Like the Yippie movement, it was much more of an in-person, like that's how they connected. So I think, and in some like ways, like with the feminist movement and stuff, they had like a clear goal for meeting in mind. And that's like why they did what they did when. And they had these goals ahead of time. So what they did and what they wore was for a specific reason. But now we have things like with social media, you do it because everyone else does it, not because there's a reason behind it. Like, or if it is, like, it's more of like a superficial reason. Like there's like this trend today, it's called like the Visco girl, like with the scrunchies, like a certain brand of water bottles. And you do it just to fit in. You don't do it because there's a reason behind it. Like, oh, I'm doing this because I believe it will show that I'm for like women's rights or something. And I think that's one way things have changed since then.
Yeah, it's a lot less organized. It's like individual people like speaking their mind or like doing this or doing that, but it's less of like one cohesive group that's working to like make an impact and make changes.
Mm-hmm. So if we slide over to the article, to the passages out of the Klein book, what about this idea that people used to be more independent? People didn't call themselves independents necessarily. They aligned themselves with a party, but he talks about splitting tickets, right? They were more willing to pick and choose. Well, I'll take, I'll take the Republican for governor, but I'll take the Democrat for president, and who I vote for Congress, will depend on whatever. And that over time, and especially in the very recent past, has sort of virtually disappeared.
Absolutely. I've seen it in my family, for example. My great-grandpa, he generally he tended to stick towards the right, but he voted for Democrats. He wasn't, I'm a strict Republican, and he's talked about it. Oh yeah, I voted for this senator and he was a Republican, but overall I for the president I voted for a Democrat. And so it wasn't this strong like I'm a rightist and a leftist, or I'm a Democrat or Republican. It was, I'm going to vote for who has my best interests in mind, not because of party, not because of their party.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, somewhere along the line it became less about like the person, like your personal beliefs, and looking at the individual issues and like stances on different things that like each candidate would support or oppose. And it became more just, I'm going to support whoever my party supports. And like, I'm not going to look any further than that. I'm just going to mark like Republican or Democrat on my ticket. And that's the end of the story.
Mm-hmm. Right. And to some extent that has to do with, well, the issues are very complex and there are a lot of them. So I'm going to trust, and that's kind of the essence of representative government too, right? I'm going to trust somebody to, have my interests at heart. But what about the idea that, that Klein talks about, that actually people's love of their own party has decreased, but their distrust and their dislike of the other guy has increased. And so oftentimes you get people, are doing this adversarial voting. They're voting against something rather than voting for something.
Yeah, that makes sense. It really reminds me of that comment, it's a better of two evils. I think in some cases people might not completely support their party, but they would rather, half-heartedly vote than completely vote for somebody that they didn't agree with. It seems like one thing, too, the difference between 1968 and now is the parties are more like in flux for what you could believe. Like it's so, because like the Republican of Abraham Lincoln is completely different than the Republican of now, and that didn't happen over time. It happened over time. It just didn't, okay, at this point they changed. So I think today we're seeing it more and more, their solid permanent stances rather than in flux. And I know in 1968 it was a flux year. At the end of the article, it kind of talks about how Nixon was able to kind of change something. So maybe that's part of the reason why people feel more obligated to vote one or the other, because they're not changing as much.
So is what you're arguing, Emily, that even though the country was culturally polarized in 1968, in a sense, the parties were significantly less polarized than they are today. And
yes,
that's an important difference.
I think so, yes.
I think that's a really good point, because like if you like bring up an issue and then say like ask people like what they think like the Democrat or Republican Party would think about it, you pretty much can figure out like the overall party stance on any given issue, just knowing like the basics of politics, which like just goes to your point that their stances on things aren't in flux anymore. They're really set in stone and they don't change.
And like one interesting thing that kind of reminded me of is like they did a study right as soon as, I don't know if it was right when Trump was elected or right before Trump was elected, but something along those lines. They took Obamacare, like everything that Obamacare entailed, took Obamacare off of it, slapped a different name on it, said it was supported by Trump, and asked people, do you like Obamacare? No, we hate Obamacare. Do you support Trump's new healthcare plan? Absolutely. But it was the exact same thing, just two different names slapped on it. And people were, very strongly, no, I don't like Obamacare, but I like this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So there's a lot of discussion about tribalism. And I think that's what we're sort of getting at here, tribalism in American politics. Is that a term that you three have heard of before, where it's basically that it is a lot of the polarization we see in American politics is less, well, it is issue-based, but it's more than issue-based. It's more that you have an alignment with a particular group of people, right? And so you're defensive about maintaining that alignment, i.e. your tribe. And so it's more about your conflict with the other tribe than your particular ideological stance. I mean, Dan, is that a decent explanation of tribalism?
Yeah, or like pro sports.
Yeah, like the sports analogy. There you go. So the two political parties have become like sports teams, right? And one thing I wondered as I was reading, oh hey, Jake's here. As I was reading the Ezra Klein article, is I think Klein was arguing that this tribalism is a relatively recent development historically. You agree with that, the interpretation, Dan? And that's what I wondered about. I wasn't sure if I agreed with that. And I guess I was curious what your takes were, because I see certainly the case to be made that the middle was stronger in the 50s and 60s than it is today. I'm not convinced when you look at the sum scope of American history, whether that is really true when you zoom out, right? You know, the full 200 and some odd years that the U.S. has existed. That's, I don't know. What did you guys think about that? Did you agree? I guess, okay, I'm not wording this question right. Do you agree, Ezra Klein, that this is a really recent development and a unique development for the previous 20, 30 years or so?
I would argue that it's not. Like after the Civil War, we saw a huge, it was all Republican dominated presidencies. And so there wasn't any Republican leaders, and that's, I would argue, because it was the same ideal of tribalism where we don't like the Republicans because of what they did in the Civil War. It might be different, it might have a different context now, but I don't think that this is a completely new idea. I think it might come and go with different generations, but I don't think it's specific to our generation.
Yeah, I think you
might be able to like see it more clearly now, just with like the whole social media thing. Like we can see how like increased that polarization is like as it's happening versus like in historical hindsight. But like with your example of the Civil War, like I mean, we talk about in our Civil War class, like how extremely politically polarized the North and the South were like leading up to the Civil War. So I think that polarization and like supporting your side has always been there, like maybe not consistently to the degree that it is today, but I think we can see it in different parts of history where like people were fiercely protective of their side or their party.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think what Kate was pointing out, the whole waving the bloody shirt thing. I mean, the way Republicans, retained power during that time was by sort of villainizing the Democrats as the party of slavery. And Stephanie, what you're talking about is there's a great book called Fields of Blood that's about basically people brawling and dueling and beating the heck out of each other, and inside Congress, and then it sort of expands out onto the streets, and people get in duels, and it's just totally crazy through the 1830s, 1840s.
Yeah, I didn't realize the full scope of this till I was in grad school, but apparently that was a thing, in the 1830s and 40s, and it wasn't like, we're not just talking like a random incident here of a couple congressmen, like, you know, the famous example I'm sure you've all heard of is like the caning of Charles Sumner. That was not in isolation. And it wasn't just something that happened in DC. Like, I was just reading the other day about, I'm working on a book review about this incident in Indiana where the Speaker of the House got in a fist fight with one of the representatives in the 1840s, and you had like people cheering them both on. So this was pretty widespread in the antebellum era. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that, so that whole thing, you know, I think supports the idea that this concept of negative partisanship has been around for a long time as well. You know, the idea that, yeah, I might not really like my guy, you know, but I really hate, you know, I might not really like Trump, but I really hate Hillary Clinton. You know, and I think that was hugely, you know, motivating for a lot of people. You know, and there's a whole lot of, you know, there's a whole lot more to that story about, you know, sort of the corruption and inside baseball kind of dirty dealing that went with that.
So here becomes the real question then. If there is precedence for what you just described, Dan, and what we've all been describing of tribalism and, you know, polarization, and the other side, you know, being, you vote for your own party because it's the lesser of two evils. If that really isn't that unusual, then is it possible that the Ezra Klein book actually was 180 degrees wrong in this? That the 50s, the 40s, and the 50s were what were abnormal, and what is today is actually the norm in American politics. I'm just throwing that out there. I'm wondering what you guys think about it.
Who says there has to be a norm, though? Could there not be cycles? Does it have to be this is what's normal and this is what's abnormal? Maybe it's this is how people feel, and it slowly circulates until it becomes until it morphs into something else.
That's a good point. What about the chart on page 215? Because I think that it is, like Kate says, I think it is cyclical, and I think it has to do with these occasional long periods of total party control. Because Klein talks about, you know, this thing where, you know, the party in power is so in power that, you know, that the party out of power has to kind of work with them, right? And doesn't make it their mission to blow up everything and to make them completely ineffective, you know, so that, you know, in the next election cycle it'll be swept out, and, you know, and we'll get the House and the Senate back, kind of thing. So I would say it would be cyclical, and it would have to do with how deep that control, that single party control, would be. I really think that somebody should write a history of congressional party control. You know, instead of these American histories that are presidential administration oriented.
I'd say that I definitely agree that it's cyclical, and we see different time periods where this trend kind of pops up more intensely than other times. But I think part of what might make the argument for like the polarization we're seeing today be like different is just the presence, like the overpowering presence of the media, like not just social media, but like all the different news outlets that can like blast stories and things that like may or may not be true. Like it's just information overload all the time, and it's hard to sort through it. So it, and like kind of like fact check all these different stories and things that you're hearing. So if you see something bad about Hillary Clinton, but you don't take the time to fact check it, like that's going to be solidified in your mind and you're going to be like, no, I'm definitely not going to vote for her. So I think like the way that the polarization is like presenting itself might seem different just because of like how it's presented like to the American public through like media and things like that. But I don't think that it's a new concept.
That's a really good point. In the antebellum era, you also had that lack of filtration with the media. It was different media, right? It wasn't online media, but with the newspapers.
Yellow press, yeah.
It was yellow press. It was aligned with.
Oh, you're muted, John.
I just wonder, I mean, you guys keep on talking about cyclicality. I'm wondering if in some ways we are experiencing not a second coming of 1968, but a second coming of the antebellum era. I almost see more similarities there. I don't know, which is sort of ominous.
But it makes sense because like we've had discussions like in our Civil War class where like the issues might be different that like people are arguing about, but like the intensity and like the ways with which they go about it, like we've already made connections in like the Civil War class. Like I know we've talked about like abortion a couple times in that class, like just like how politically charged that is and like different people's opinions on it and stuff and how it relates to what was happening in the antebellum era. So I would agree that like there's a lot of similarities between then and now.
Mm-hmm.
That is kind of ominous.
I'm not, I don't know. I'm not trying to be the bearer of bad news. I just, you know, and perhaps it's just because that is a time period I specialize in, and so I'm able to see these similarities more than perhaps you know, the average American could. But I certainly see more similarities in the party structures of today than the similarities in the party structure of '68. I think the populism that you see today has antecedents in the antebellum era. I think the polarization that's reflected in the parties has antecedent in the antebellum era. I don't know.
So
Are we on a path to a second Civil War?
Well, but see, the difference is there isn't a regionalism. And I think it's very difficult to have a civil war if you don't have a regionality to the polarization.
So what would you theorize is the way to fix this polarization? How do we go about that? We fixed it after the antebellum period, after the Civil War, and you know, how do you think that might come about today?
See, well, I have always, I don't know if I want to say this because this is being recorded and I'm not certain I want the entire world to know. But how do I put this? I think you guys have both, all four of you sound like you are acknowledging that there's a cyclicality to American polarization. I think I am in agreement with that. And if there is a cyclicality, that implies that something like there will be a course corrective, right? If you get what I'm saying. I'm not convinced that course corrective, isn't embedded in the system itself. Or I am convinced, I am of the opinion that it might be embedded in the system itself. In other words, I am less pessimistic than Klein is about all this. I think it may just work its way out. I will put it that way.
Laissez-faire.
Hey, I'm not I think that the whole idea of the hidden hand in laissez-faire economics is rather extreme, but I do think that systems operate and they do have cycles, and it would be unwise to recognize or to ignore that there is such a thing as a cycle in systems, right? That's all I'm saying.
So we're kind of acknowledging, so we're kind of acknowledging the cliche that like history repeats itself, like in one form or another. So while we're probably not working our way towards another civil war, something that's going to correct the polarization we're seeing is probably going to happen at some point.
I personally believe that the only way to fix this polarization is for us as a country to identify that it is happening, and for us to come together and be educated enough to understand how it's happening. And until we come to that conclusion, I think it's going to continue, and I think it's going to get worse. But I think that in order to fix it, we need to stop, thinking that the next politician, the next president is going to fix everything, because it's not going to happen. And I think that as a community, we need to come together and say we want change, and this is how it will happen. And I think that's the only way for that to happen, other than, a civil war or something.
And I think people often ignore the fact that there are checks and balances in place. So like whoever you elect as president can't just like first day in office make good on all the promises they made during their election. Like there's hoops they have to jump through to make that sort of stuff happen, and not all of it's going to be put into place.
And
so I think that like people focus too much on the presidential election and less on like congressional and local elections, which are just as important, because the president can't make all the decisions himself.
Right, and actually, I think Klein does talk about that elsewhere in the book, where he talks about. Oh, hey, Melissa.
Hey, Melissa.
He talks about how the 2008 hope and change revolution, right, that never happened, because there used to be an old joke during the Clinton years that that Bill Clinton came into the White House with all of these ideas about all the things he was going to do, and on his first day in office, they took him down to the Situation Room, and and they showed him a video. And he comes out of the Situation Room, and it's all different. He it's like, okay, and he becomes part of the machine. So that there's a and I guess that's kind of a sort of a deep state sort of conspiracy theory about how they show him the whatever the video is, the film from the grassy knoll or whatever, but that there's something that happens, when somebody, becomes part of the system. And that's why Klein is talking, at the beginning says, I want to talk about systems, not about people.
Mm-hmm. I mean, let's go to that, because I think that is one of his more provocative points. What do you feel about that? He really plays an emphasis on systems rather than the role that any one individual, any one politician plays within that system. What do you guys think about that?
Well, he says that, like, one of his lines in there is, we try to fix the system by changing the people who run it, only to find that they become part of the system too, which is what we've been talking about. And I think that, like, it's a really good point that like I hadn't really thought about before, because like one person elected as president can't change the whole system. Like that's something that like the collective government has to work on together. But if no one's drawing attention to the problem that the system is causing versus potential problems that the person they don't like in office is causing, then nothing is going to get fixed.
Yeah.
And we definitely focus now on, you know, the next president who's going to fix all of our problems. You know, it's I feel like after the presidential elections, people are they just sit back and wait and watch to see if they actually make any change. And when they don't, they get upset and, well, let's find the next big thing, you know, the next president to make that change, and aren't looking at the system itself.
And Kate, you talked about earlier about like how like you think that the way to change it is like educating like the masses. And I'd say that like I definitely agree with that. I didn't even have like a class in school that talked about American government till I was a senior in high school. Mm-hmm. That was the first time that like anyone took the time, like besides breaking up like the branches of government and like explaining those, like my senior year in high school was the first time that like I'd ever been introduced to like the inner workings of like the government system. And I was amazed at like all the different bits and pieces that were a part of it to make it function. And so I think that like the education aspect won't just come from like the public, but also like from the educational system, because not everybody goes to college and has that experience of like talk like situations like this where we're like talking and like analyzing different things. Not everybody has that experience, but the majority of people do go to like elementary, middle, and high school. So if you add more of that like educational aspect on how the government works into that sort like that part of people's lives, I think that that could help like make changes happen eventually.
That's a good point.
However, I would argue that's a very slippery slope, you know, because especially when you talk about politics, even if you try not to give your input, you're still going to influence how you're talking about it in your views. You're never going to be completely loss of words, but you're not going to be completely unbiased. You're going to have some of your own personal beliefs rub off. And so it's kind of a slippery slope, because yes, you do want to educate people in high school and situations like that, but I don't think that just knowledge of the system is what's going to change the system. Mm-hmm. You know,
out of curiosity, would you guys say that I am particularly, that I express my political opinions a lot in class? Just curious.
Not
curious about the same question regarding myself. But you answer Dan's question first.
I don't think so. But then, you know, it's like when we get into those conversations, that does come out a little bit, you know, from conversations we've had in class, like when we had that conversation about gun rights, you know, your opinion comes out a little bit, and that's expected because everybody has an opinion. But I don't think that you necessarily project that onto the classroom.
No, I would say the same. I remember, like, I don't even know when, earlier this semester, we were talking about some sort of like minuscule politics topic, and you mentioned that like you're more than willing to have you want to have conversations with people who like think differently than you. And I think that like that's the way to do it. Like, just be open-minded to hearing like other people's sides, like acknowledging the fact that your students aren't going to have the same political views as you all the time.
Yeah, I was surprised. I've always kind of felt like I am I'm mostly preaching to a group, especially in the surveys, a group of students who, for the most part, are on the other side, sometimes way on the other side politically. I mean, in US 2 this semester, I had people close their eyes and raise their hands, and of the people who chose one way or the other, like 2/3 chose Republican, right, with their eyes closed, so they wouldn't, and Emily, you remember in that other class, the people from the back, with the Trump 2020 sticker on their computer were complaining about how much of a minority they feel and how they feel like they are, and how much they think that they are, they've got to be careful about what they say and they've got to keep their mouths shut. And, and going back to the other article, the 1968 article, that was the group that Nixon tried to align himself with, right? This silent majority, these people, these regular people, these working class people who are just fed up with the system and with, and with the elitism. And then, and the author of that article, I thought, tried a little bit too hard to connect that with sort of identity politics and political correctness today, because I don't think it was exactly the same thing. But but now it is, it's sort of turned into that. Now it seems like, identity politics and the whole, even the populists, the left populists are critical of, of the corporate Democrats for being, too interested in these, in putting, this kind of BS into the recovery bill. I don't know, that was a long rant. I don't know where I began and where I ended with that. Melissa, what's going on?
Hi. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Oh, okay, thank goodness. I've been having a lot of issues with Zoom, so. What do you want to know?
So what do you think? We've been talking kind of around we started with the 1968 article, and now we're sort of into the Klein thing. And yeah, just interested in, hearing from you about it, your perspective.
I've been putting them up just to get a refresher on what they're about, because it's been a while since I've read them. But I think to answer, your question earlier about if your political affiliation comes out in class, I think yours a little bit more than Dr. Ellis, even though I've had more classes with him. But I think it comes out with like some jokes that you make sometimes, or just stuff like that. Yeah.
I think us, like the older students like us who has like had historiography, we like try to figure out what school of thought you guys follow more than anything else.
Yeah.
Well, I'm always curious about that. So something I will say about myself, part of my teaching philosophy is to be very guarded about what my personal politics are. And I think you might be seeing that. I do that on purpose because, and I think this is a really good conversation for you all to have, because you will all be in a situation of leadership. You may or may not become educators someday. You have to decide for yourselves what works for you with, your political stance. And there are some instructors, actually I was just reading the professional development reports of the people in my department who are more open about their political stances with their students than others. And there are good reasons good reasons for both stances to be more neutral or to be more clear about where you are personally. All that to say, though, it's something that you need to grapple with, because in whatever leadership position you are in someday, you will have to grapple with that question when you're working with other people. Yeah.
I mean, personally, I've had more experiences with like my high school teachers sharing their political beliefs more aggressively than any college professor I've had so far.
Really?
Yeah, especially my AP US government teacher. he was a hardcore liberal and not afraid to tell us about it in every topic that we covered. And since I want to teach social studies, I think that's something that like I keep in mind. Like, I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing to share like bits and pieces of your political beliefs, but there's a fine line between just like presenting the information to like your students versus like badgering your students and being like, this is right and anything else is wrong. So it's definitely something that I pay attention to.
And I would almost argue that your political affiliation is almost similar to your religious affiliation. You know, I'm not as comfortable with teachers who are, you know, who talk about their religious affiliation just as the same as political affiliation. And I think that that even though you have your own beliefs, that you shouldn't be able to project them onto your students. I think that you can absolutely, present them, but I don't think that it's morally right to project it.
I agree, because I think because when you're teaching like high school students, for example, about like how the government system works, your political affiliation doesn't add anything to the lesson of how the government works. Like, you can approach it in a more objective manner without interjecting your political beliefs into the lessons. They're going to get the same information regardless. And if you present it as as unbiased as possible, obviously it's not going to be possible to remain completely unbiased. But if you present it as unbiased as humanly possible, then your students are going to be able to make conclusions themselves.
So to tie this to historiography, Emily, and this is sort of an inside discussion, Emily and Melissa, it sounds to me like Kate and Stephanie are definitely not postmodernists. Would you agree with this?
Yep.
I don't know if I would agree with that.
Well,
but
okay.
But to take it. Go ahead, Kate.
Can you explain what that means, just so I'm at least
okay? So there's more than one. First of all, there is more than one variety of postmodern, but as it generally applies to historiography, it is the acknowledgement that there is no such thing as neutrality, because there is no truth with a capital T. Everyone has their biases. Everyone has their political agendas. And therefore, there are multiple truths with small letter t's, not a truth with a capital T. And therefore, there's no such thing as truly being neutral. It is a cultural illusion. Neutrality is a cultural illusion that is culturally dependent, right? It is contextualized, but based on your culture. This is that is sort of a hackneyed definition of postmodernism, but I think that would generally be accepted as being accurate.
But it goes to what Klein is talking about on 125 and 126 too, right? Where he's talking about the what he calls the democratization of discomfort, right? The idea that we are going, that now we're hearing, and I disagree with that concept of the democratization of discomfort. That we're going to hear more voices now, right, than we used to, when it was all just, middle-aged white guys running the show. And that now that the middle-aged white guys will occasionally be uncomfortable because, we'll call attention, because history will have to call attention to, other things that aren't part of what used to be called the master narrative. And this question about whose grievances get heard is something that, people who try to reject what they call political correctness oftentimes complain about, right? That, oh, these people are complaining about the way, do we have to continue hearing about slavery? Well, do we? Yeah, we do. Do we have to hear, do we have to hear about what happened, when the Europeans got to the Caribbean? Yeah, we actually kind of do. Because the fact that it makes the white middle-aged dudes uncomfortable is kind of the point.
So I actually have to cut out right now because I think I've got a meeting with someone else. If you guys are still rolling, I will try to come back, but I got to do this other meeting. So I'll see you guys later.
Thanks, John.
Yep.